On another rung of this strange ladder of existence we're on, a woman named Marilyn Gosselin, who calls herself the smartest woman in the world, was writing a similar column for Parade magazine. And at one point, she printed all of the questions that had baffled her, she couldn't answer. So my editor thought it would be funny if I tried to answer them. And so I did. I provided, for example, the names of the 5 toes, which Marilyn Gosselin was unable to do. They are Oxnard, Secretary, Clapmatch, Jess, and Matey. Or they are now, anyway. And I explained that the reason that Lincoln was the only president who faced right on American coins was because he was the only one that wasn't a Freemason. To my surprise, people read these and thought that I had made up Marilyn Gosselin. All of which leads us to the most puzzling kind of hoax, which is the pseudo-hoax. And by this I mean something that was intended as purely innocent fiction and presented to the audience in all candor as a completely false work of the imagination, untarnished by truth, which is then believed. One of the classic examples is Edgar Allan Poe wrote a story called The Facts in the Case of Monsieur Valdemar, in which a man is mesmerized at the point of death and lies suspended in this sort of eerie half-life until the connection is broken, and then he crumbles into a nearly liquid mass of loathsome, of detestable putridity. It's an impeccable work of fiction, a blameless lie from the first word to the last, but it was accepted as fact in England and Scotland. And Mark Twain once recalled that early in his career, he concocted a phony murder for a news story and then planted all of these glaring errors and discrepancies that would be perfectly obvious to anybody from the town throughout the story as clues that the whole thing was just a joke. He thought this was a funny idea and that people would read the story and would gradually realize that he was pulling their leg. But unfortunately, his readers skipped all of the clever hints that he put because they wanted to get to the gory stuff and be happy. The photographic pseudo-hoax is somewhat of a problem these days, particularly because we are now so inundated with images. Some of you may recall that a photo of an extraterrestrial circulated a few years ago and was eventually identified as a snapshot of a model that was made for the Montreal World's Fair, which was then given to someone in Russia, who then passed it along to somebody else, and eventually it made its way back to North America with all of its history shorn away. And in this, nobody was making any attempt to deceive anybody. They were just passing along this image. But by the time it got back to the US, a completely fake story had attached to it, and the result was that the little model of a space sprite was thought to be a real being. And it may also be inevitable that film stills are now taken frequently out of context. Since so many films are made and special effects have now gotten to be so good and so sophisticated, that often convincing photos are stripped of their context and multiplied, particularly across the internet. There was, for example, a recent one of a photo of a woman looking up in the sky and seeing clouds forming the image of a teddy bear, which was passed along as real, but was a still from a French film called Amélie. And on the subject of photos, the Metropolitan Museum of Art recently mounted a large show devoted to spirit photography. It was a fascinating show, particularly to somebody like me who was fascinated by the history of spiritualism, to see exactly what a 19th century cabinet looks like and all of that. But it was even more fascinating to eavesdrop on my fellow art lovers. What was most interesting was the sheer number of people who felt compelled to talk loudly about how stupid those old people must have been back then to fall for such obviously fake photos. Of course, we're lucky now because we have much more sophisticated lies. We tend to forget, particularly in that kind of a context, that almost every photograph that we see is a hoax, particularly any commercial photograph. It's been artfully posed, styled, cropped, and retouched in this never-ending battle to hold the truth at bay. Sometimes the pseudo-hoax will turn and convert to flat-out deception. I recently had the pleasure of hanging out in a bar in New York with one of our era's most august hoaxmeisters, Alan Abel. His first hoax was Pseudo, the Society for the Indecency of Naked Animals, which was an organization devoted to putting pants on dogs and horses. His motto was, a nude horse is a rude horse. I hadn't known this before, but apparently that began as a work of fiction. He wrote it just as a humor piece and submitted it to the Saturday Evening Post. And they rejected it, and in fact wrote an indignant letter saying that they didn't think his idea was a good one. So he was surprised that they thought that he was serious about it and realized that he could actually do it as a hoax. And that in fact set him off on his career of hoaxing. And to finish, from Charles Fort, who, as you know, is incapable of telling a lie, just like George Washington. He wrote from New Lands, but this book is fiction in the sense that Pickwick Papers and the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and Uncle Tom's Cabin, Newton's Principia, Darwin's Origin of Species, Genesis, Gulliver's Travels, and mathematical theorems, and every history of the United States, and all other histories are fictions.